Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. For both January and February of this year, I've made videos talking about 8 books scheduled for publication in the U.S. that particular month. And I thought I would do the same for March. And then I looked at my list of March books and realized that there was no way I could narrow it down to 8 choices. It's a very full month coming up in the publishing world, and it's coming in like a lion. So I'm going to talk about 8 books coming out in early March. I suppose I'll need to make a sequel for the second half of the month. Also, I'll say that mine is a very personal list with my own quirky obsessions and personal taste leading to my choices. In other words, this is in no way exhaustive of all that's coming out. March 4th is quite a full release day. A lot of folks who follow upcoming books have been talking about the memoir Raising Hare by Chloe Dalton. This is the story of a British political advisor who spent the height of the pandemic in the English countryside, where she rescued a newborn hare that had just been attacked by a dog. She wanted to care for the animal in the emergency and intended to return it as soon as possible to the wilderness, but over time, the hare becomes her companion, free to come and go, but usually choosing to sleep with her, to give birth to babies in her study, etc. I love these stories of humans and other animals coming together, and I'm looking forward to this one. Well, let me mention a few books that have gotten less attention. The first is one I've already read, and which I'm writing a review of for publication. That is Making Sense of Slavery, America's Long Reckoning from the Founding Era to Today by Scott Spillman. I won't go into great detail here, but I will say that studying historiography, that is, the history of how historians have written history, was a big part of preparing for comprehensive exams in graduate school. I especially loved reading classic works by historians studying slavery, from W.E.B. Du Bois to C. Vann Woodward to Genovese, etc. It was fascinating to see how the discovery or new appreciation of additional primary sources utterly transformed the field over the course of the 20th century, as did the inclusion of historians from a wider range of society than just elite white men from New England. Initially, that inclusion was of white Southern historians and historians from America's West. But eventually it meant black scholars and women scholars. Not infrequently, their backgrounds inspired them to consider questions that previous historians had not. So the field expanded, not just in who became historians, but what sources got used and what subjects got talked about, and political developments over the course of the 20th century also altered how historians approached the past. What I want to say here is that in grad school, we were learning the approaches of different scholars in different historical schools, but Spillman's book frames the story in a much larger light, showing how the context of the times shaped the scholarship and how the scholarship shaped the world into which the books emerged. As soon as my review is published, I will give you a link. Another historical work is Spell Freedom, The Underground Schools That Built the Civil Rights Movement by Elaine Weiss. Here she's looking at the activists who, in the 1950s, created the idea of citizenship schools, designed to prepare Black Southerners to pass literacy tests for voting that Southern states had enacted in an effort to disenfranchise Black citizens. Eventually, nearly 1,000 citizenship schools were established, serving tens of thousands of people. The founders of this movement were the Black educator Septima Clark, a small businessman named Esau Jenkins, Miles Horton, a white Southerner who had been active in the labor movement, and beautician-turned-teacher Bernice Robinson. In addition to teaching an enormous number of people to read and write, these citizenship schools nurtured many young activists, men and women, black and white, Southern and not Southern. This was grassroots activism. And in many ways, this kind of work was at the core of the civil rights movement, more at the time than leaders like Martin Luther King, even. Septima Clark was quite a force, and she traveled throughout the South speaking with young activists in a variety of states. My father was active in the civil rights movement in South Carolina, and one of his jobs was to be the driver for various visiting dignitaries. Driving Septima Clark was one of his very favorite memories. I can't wait to read the book. On to my next choice. I know a lot of you read and loved The Barbizon by Paulina Bren, which came out a few years ago. I'll leave a link to my published review down below. One of the groups that heavily used that women's hotel was the Katharine Gibbs School, which for much of the 20th century trained young women for high-level secretary positions, secretaries who would serve corporate executives, who were at that point pretty much exclusively men. Vanda Krefft has written a detailed study of the Gibbs School called Expect Great Things, How the Katharine Gibbs School Revolutionized the American Workplace for Women. I'm looking forward to reading it. The publisher's description of the book suggests that the school not only trained these young women, and sometimes slightly older women too, to dress the part and be able to type quickly, but to, as the press material says, get out of the secretarial pool and assume positions of power on the other side of the desk. Readers might be a little skeptical about that claim, but Krefft shares evidence that, in fact, Gibbs graduates did exactly that. So the author is emphasizing this link between traditionally female jobs and broader opportunities for work in higher level jobs as well. Interesting, for sure. Onto a very different kind of work. I want to call your attention to a University Press book out from Columbia University Press. That is Shadow Work, Loneliness, and the Literary Life by Emily Hodgson Anderson. Anderson is interested in the way both reading and writing are solitary pursuits that also deeply connect us with other people. What a booktube book! Here we are talking about what we usually do in silence, alone, and making friends all over the globe based on that practice. Well, Anderson is thinking about it a little more deeply than my little quip. She's looking at literary criticism, thinking about labor, etc. She's considering authors from Austen to Shakespeare, from Roald Dahl to Laura Ingalls Wilder, and many others who have sometimes given us a sense of intimacy with people we've never met, and even people who are utterly imaginary. The last book coming out on March 3rd that I want to mention is Where the Old Roses Grow, Vita Sackville-West and the Battle for Beauty During Wartime by Janelle McCulloch. This is a short little book that will appeal to the garden lovers among us. Just recently, I watched a lovely video from Lindy over at Lindy's Magpie Reads, where she talks about the link between gardening and reading books about gardening. I've done quite a bit of that in the last few weeks, partly as a way of dealing with the state of my nation right now. Anyway, I love the idea of not only gardening and bookishness, but also Vita Sackville-West involved in this project. The book is also very much about history and the preservation of a legacy rooted in the appreciation of beauty, including the traditional place of roses in British history. It sounds really wonderful. As an historian interested in social history, I'm looking forward to what I assume will be a relatively complicated discussion of how many people pulled beautiful flowers from their gardens during World War II in order to grow food at a time when people were going hungry. Okay, on to two books that will be released on March 11th. The first is We Tell Ourselves Stories, Joan Didion and the American Dream Machine by Alissa Wilkinson. This book feels awfully timely right now. One of Didion's most widely quoted lines is, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." I think a lot of people take those words to be a celebration of art and free expression. But Didion's point was not celebration. She was pointing out that as a culture, and maybe as a species, we tend to create delusions for ourselves. that, as the press materials say, might ward away any anxieties when society seems to spin off its axis. She's talking about collective hallucination. In this particular book, Wilkinson is thinking specifically about Hollywood enacted that American myth-making and how Didion both participated in that process and questioned it. And speaking of storytelling, my last choice is Helen Garner's How to End a Story, Collected Diaries, 1978 to 1998. I read the beginning of this one last night, and I think I'll be reviewing it for Open Letters Review, so I won't go into a great deal of detail. Helen Garner is an Australian author, now in her 80s, who wrote one of my very favorite reads of the last few years, The Spare Room. That's a novel, although it feels quite a bit like a memoir about a woman who cares for her friend who is dying of cancer. It's a quiet book, and a thoughtful one that never seems too dramatic or sensational. The book really focuses on the caretaker's emotions and understandings rather than the ill woman's. The part I felt was most important is the effects of denial versus deep acknowledgement of where a terminal illness will end. I certainly recommend this short novel. How to End a Story is not a novel at all, of course. Instead, it's a bind-up of 3 journals that she's published before. Her tone, at least in the little bit I have read so far, is funny and vulnerable and straightforward and intensely thoughtful at the same time. The journals talk about her experiences and goals as a writer, her family life, the relationships she develops, and the politics and culture of the times in which she's writing. There is something we learn from people looking back on their lives with the perspective of hindsight. But there's something we learn from people's immediate responses at the time, too. And Garner is a master at absorbing what's going on and handing it back to us. I can't wait to read the rest of the book. Okay, as I said before, I'll probably make another video about more books coming out in March, in the latter part of March, sometime soon. Happy reading to all of you. See you soon here on Hannah's Books.